as fuck podcast.
We in here, baby.
Let's get it.
I love that. We in here, baby.
I was gonna say that part stood out to me this morning too.
Yeah. Soko was hella gangster on that. We in here, baby.
West Coast vibes. Wait, but I know we need to talk about real stuff, but have you guys seen that Snoop has a store on Prairie?
Mm-hmm.
I'm
I
like,
haven't seen it.
this is so great. I love Snoop. Everything about him.
But wait, now I'm curious. Do we know what the is it just a store, like a market?
His clothing stuff.
Okay.
It's called like Snoop Dogg Funk Store or something. I couldn't quite read it as I'm driving by.
Yeah, they have clothing in there. They have a lot of like Snoop related like clothing print. Like I don't know if you've ever seen him wear like his bomber jacket that has like Doggy Style, the album cover, like all over it, like stuff like that. Yeah.
Oh man.
Go.
We back at it. Another week, another day, another topic. No, always happy to be with y'all this morning. How y'all feeling?
Good.
I'm feeling awake in here.
I'm feeling good. These allergies is whipping my ass this morning, so if I sound a little stuffy on the listener end, that's why. But overall, still pretty good. Just the annoyance. I'm gonna try not to do that little black, the little throat noise people make when they have that.
The finger in the air.
I never understood that. Like people tell me that like that's the itch or something, and it's like soothing. I've never known the mechanisms of like doing this thing in your ear and making that noise. I guess it gets to the back of the throat or something.
I think it's like that ear. Yeah,
But
I
some
think it's
people
like
are
that
good.
ear, nose, throat connection. Like somewhere in there, it's just this itch, and you're like trying all of the things to scratch the back.
The only way you get it. Some people be good at
or go ahead, Rob.
No, go ahead, Tris.
I was about to say, or the people who do it in the mornings. Like, thankfully, my wife doesn't do it. But growing up, just having family members, you spend a night at the house, you'd be like, here they go with that shit. Like, they go at the top of the morning, they just go into town.
I'm a sufferer. I don't know how to do any of those things, like how people can just bring up phlegm and get it out. I just be suffering with that until it dissolves on its own because I don't know any of the techniques.
Last night, Gabby used a tuning fork on me. I don't know if you guys have ever had a tuning fork. It's like this prong and this gong in your ear. And I feel like, if I ever have that itch, I'm going to have Gabby come.
I saw a website where you could buy those. You could learn how to use them in different ways for different ailments or cleansing, spiritual stuff. It's very interesting. Sound.
Mm-hmm.
The tools to heal are plenty.
Man, all right. Y'all know what time it is. Time to check in. So.
Okay. So we're back to talk about some boundaries again. So I felt like the question should be around boundaries. So Rob and Tris, we haven't broken down levels of boundary setting and how, here's level 1, here's level 2. So I'll say scale from 0 to 10. 10 being bomb-ass boundary setters, 0 being like, what's a boundary? Where would you guys say you rate yourselves right now in your ability to set boundaries and have peace with the boundaries you set?
Ooh.
That's a you are trying to expose us.
Look, let me tell you, I ain't no level 10. And I was like, oh shit. Now I gotta say out loud that I ain't no level 10, but I was like, thankfully in my sessions, I'm really transparent and I'll tell my clients, like, I know that I'm telling you this, but trust me, I struggle with this too. So I'm like, all right, cool. It's not like I'm out here acting like a level 10 in sessions. But I think if I had to put a number, you said we haven't defined it. I'm thinking 10 is like, and I don't know why in my head the number also has to somehow correlate to comfort doing it. Like if creates this whole ancient spiral for you, then you can't be a 10 in my mind. So that's why I'm like, even if I...
Mine too. That and that's what I said too. 10 would be like I said it well and I don't give a fuck about it.
I'm gonna go with 5 because I'm not gonna say I'm like a 1 or 2 because I for sure am pretty good at like knowing what I absolutely don't want to do. Actually, I'm gonna say maybe like a 5, between a 5 and a 6. If I'm being gracious, like I know what I don't want to do. I know what my limitations are. It's just like when that self-sacrificial piece kicks in, and now I'm like, or I'm too worried about what it's gonna feel like. So I think still navigating that piece, but I'm gonna go with 5, 5 to 6. What about you?
Well,
All
let's
right,
call
I'll
it
take that. I'll
5.5,
take a
Tris.
5 point.
Let's hit them decimals because it can be very incremental. I have a funny little story. Then I'll give you my rating for myself because I'll be honest with you, I vacillate. It just depends on what it is and who it is, right? Or the situation at hand. But I was getting I went to get a Reiki and a little in this other theta healing. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's it's kind of like more of a connection of like it's not like a talk therapy thing, but it like you do kind of set an intention out loud and you kind of like get into that space of like that subconscious space where you're feeling really relaxed and connected. And so the woman that I was doing it with, we were talking about boundaries because that has been a huge struggle for me, especially in family and like work, all the relationships, right? And so like she does this thing where like you can test your strength in what your thoughts are by like holding your middle finger and your thumb together, and then the person asks you a question and you answer it, and then basically like a little lie detector with your body, right? And so she asked me about boundaries, and she put her tried to break apart my two fingers. And when she asked me about the importance of boundaries, very firm. She could not break through the fingers. I was like, yeah, I believe in boundaries. I know boundaries are important. Like, I'm very firm in that. Then she asked me about setting the boundaries, and boy, did those two little fingers break apart. And I was like, listen, I know about boundaries for sure, but setting them and holding them gets shaky for me, especially because we were specifically talking about family. And so like I said, like if I'm rating myself, it does depend on what you're talking about. I'm much better than I used to be, I think, now. But I would say, yeah, I could go anywhere between a 4 and a 6, like depending on what it is. Like I'm not level 1 or 2. Like I know the boundaries that I would like to set. I do set them, but sometimes I can allow overstepping depending on the situation, and then like having to ground myself back into it to reinforce that boundary can be the hard part for me. Is like once I allow something, like knowing that I can go back and say like, yeah, I might have gave you a little leeway here, but like that doesn't mean that that's the new norm or standard. So I would say I could vacillate between 4 and 6. And in some situations I am very like, yeah, hell no. Okay. I'm out here at an 8 or 9, depending on what it is, like where
Mm-hmm.
my threshold has been met. Like if it's a person in a romantic relationship who's really violating me, I'm very good at being like, yep, that's it for me. That's I'm done. So, you know what I mean? Depends.
Well, that sounds about right based on our last one was accountability, where you mentioned your experience with a narcissist. It's like the pain, because
Mhm.
of the pain you went through. I think that domain, you're
Yeah.
like, ooh, I excel here, right? I'm good here. Yes. So expert in romance, maybe B
Oh yeah,
minus in
yeah.
the other
Family
domains
it
or
gets
something.
real tedious and tricky. But yeah, certain things where I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
you're not a person I actually have to see periodically, or you're a person, or you're a situation that I know I'm leaving or I'm walking away from at some point. I don't feel
Yeah.
as adamant about like really exploring or like trying to figure out like how do I meet this situation where I can still be present in it without violating my own boundaries or my own sense of
Hmm.
self or what or my needs in that relationship. So yeah. So I'm kind of like,
Yeah.
moving around the
Yeah.
scale, which I think we all are on some level, but like
Yeah. For sure. I know I am. I'm moving around a little similar to you. I'm because I went through hell with family boundaries in the past 2 years, I've become really good at family boundaries. But we'll talk more about this. Now I can set a family boundary and not be paranoid and preoccupied with what they're thinking of me as a result of setting the boundary. So I feel like I'm going to give myself an 8, maybe 8.5 in family boundaries. But where I struggle is I still have blind spots to where I do need boundaries. And I mean completely blind, where I'll be like, whoa, shit, how am I so strong here? And I literally like, don't see it happening here. So I would say probably like, I vacillate between, I'm gonna give myself a 3 in terms of like the blind spots that show up sometimes, and then an 8.5 in my ability. Once I recognize that I need a boundary, I'm great. Like, oh, hell no, it's over. Kind of people get a little fucked up by it because I can be real sweet till I'm not. But that's just because I'm like, oh my God, I was sweet because I didn't know that you were hurting me. Now that I know you're hurting me, you're about to catch a little fire. So a wide range here also. A wide range. And trusting, I think we get better and better.
Absolutely. I was going to say, just thinking about it too, I think we don't have to go through it like just for the sake of time. We don't have to run it back. But I'm also just genuinely, generally interested in like the flip side of that. Like, that's how we would rate ourselves. But like, what would those around you rate you, right? Like, what would your family rate you? What would your friends rate you? Because when I think about it, I think about Shamila, and she for sure, she's always like, you were born with boundaries. But to me, I'm like, I don't think so. But so I think it's also interesting what we feel like versus what we present. And I guess of course, that'll look different based on the who. Like, I'm sure there may be other people who would be like, I don't know what you're talking about with you and your boundaries. But I just think it's interesting that here I am struggling to give myself even a 5. And the person in closest proximity to me and who knows me maybe the best or the best is like, nope, you're great. Like, you're phenomenal. So I think it's just interesting how people experience us and our boundaries setting too.
It is, because it goes the other way too. If you could feel really good about setting boundaries and other people are not able to take advantage of you anymore, and so they think you are a hard ass and cruel. So I try not to get too caught up in what anybody fucking thinks about my life and what I do.
Determining whether something is harmful or not, and we're all trying to like understand ourselves over time as to like, because some things may not feel harmful to us and other people can see the harm, or someone who has very strict boundaries may look at you and feel like you're being too lenient, when it's like you have a better understanding of the relationship that you might be having with a certain person, where there is some reciprocation or there is some value, but there just needs to be certain things that need to be asserted and like talked about so that you're protected and that person is protected without having to completely like remove yourself from that relationship that someone else might not see value in because they feel like all or nothing, right? They feel like you ride or die, you not. And it's like, when you step outside of that, you realize that relationships are very much so on a continuum gray area, that like they serve certain purposes and that you can still be connected to people for that reason,
Yeah, no, 100%, 100%. During the check-in, both of you pointed out or like highlighted the area of like boundaries with family, different experiences, but just like kind of called that out. And I think that's a great starting point for everybody tuning in. We're picking up off of our last episode where we're continuing to discuss boundaries. Last time we were more general, even, the semantics of it. What are boundaries? How do people use boundaries? All of that good stuff. And now just really, I guess, really thinking, what does that look like in action in certain relationships, acknowledging that pretty much, I love Soko's example. With family, it looks like this based off of experience. At work, it may look like this. In other areas, I may have blind spots. So I think what I see come up a lot, and I'm sure you two will agree, is working with folks and just our own lived experiences. It is our interpersonal relationships that boundaries get tough with. When you don't know somebody, that's easy. I don't give a fuck. I don't know you. But especially family, where it's like, this is the system, these are the rules, this is how it functions, that can be really tough, especially because 9 times out of 10, and I'm not saying that other folks, like other members in the family, aren't healing, but I'm saying as the individual who I'm usually working with, you're usually on this road alone amongst this bigger system. So it feels very isolating, and you're the one who's switching up the flow. So like you're climbing like up this uphill battle, so to speak. So I don't even necessarily have a starting question, but just saying if we start with boundaries and family, what comes to mind for either of you? Or just working with folks or your own stuff or
I found professionally and personally, I'm gonna give this a little name, that the first boundary you set is usually the most difficult and it's like the most extreme. I'm gonna call it the big kahuna. It's like people and me, we start gearing up, and we'll go through the levels of boundary setting that you may be. You start gearing up for the boundaries and noticing like, oh, this makes me feel like that. Okay, like now I'm understanding what my triggers are and who's violating and why they're violating and what I need to do to assert. And then as you're building up, this really big opportunity presents itself. This like, oh, hell to the gnaw. I know, with all that I know that I now have to honor myself. And it's also like, fuck, I gotta do it now in this way. Like, let's say, here's one example, for instance. This has not happened, but it probably should have. A client who didn't realize that they were kind of boundaryless until right before their wedding day. And realized that this is whatever, not working. And then getting married and then regretting it later, right? So like, let's say instead though, she opted to say, I can't and I won't. I can no longer push past my own emotions or pretend like they don't exist and acquiesce to yours and be in this union that doesn't serve me. That would be an example of a big kahuna. I'm thinking of what has empowered me to set boundaries is learning about boundaries, learning about my own emotions. And then I've set boundaries with each so my father's mother and my mother's mother, I've had to say explicitly no to this. And that shit ripples and ripples big. So I just want to like kind of normalize that part of the journey for y'all, that it might show up that the first one you set is going to be monumental, huge, feel overwhelming, but that's typically how it goes. Do you guys have a similar experience with boundary setting?
Absolutely. I think for me, when I think about setting the boundaries, it's like, what is our fear around it, right? It's like how people are going to respond to it and really whether or not we can handle how they respond to it, because it's going to trigger all of our concerns is the reason why we don't have it, right? It's like, I know for me, when it comes to family, the reason I struggled to set boundaries was my fear of not being able to continue to rely on them in a way that I have in this unhealthy relationship, this codependence of like, if I'm making it comfortable for them when I'm struggling or I need them in a certain way that they may have showed up at different times in my life, then I don't have to worry about not having that, or the fear of loss of that, the good parts, right? The good parts of that we've relied on from family. So when it comes down to that, like after a while, when you feel like you're the one who's receiving most of the harm from the relationship, at some point you're going to have to set that boundary that's going to be super uncomfortable for the person who you've like kind of gotten them accustomed to this type of relationship. So it's going to feel really uncomfortable. It's going to feel unsettling. It's going to feel like out of nowhere, And so like the shock of that for the person that's experiencing the boundary being set in your relationship is the thing that I think we just don't know how someone's going to respond. And we might receive their shock from a negative space, right? This idea that like, either there's something wrong with me, or how dare they feel upset about me wanting to show up for myself. And it's like, no, they're probably just shocked because we've been operating under these rules and since forever. Like, I can tell you I've set boundaries recently in my early 40s, and I'm like, okay, this person's been in my life for 40 years and they've never had to like consider me on a certain level that I required. And I never considered me. So I'm just learning to consider me. Now I'm asking you to consider me. And it's going to be a change and a shift, for all of us, I would imagine an expectation of how we show up in relationships, people getting used to that, what type of access they have to us, and what we allow, what level of control they have in our lives. Maybe if it's a sibling, an older sibling, or like a parent, and we're grown now, I'm like, look, you can't know all my business because you be telling all my business. And so they feel cut out, or, the expectation that I'm the baby sister and that I'm going to just, yield to my older brother and sister when I'm grown as hell and I have my own mind and opinions. And sometimes my insight is greater than my older siblings and they could learn a few things or whatever that looks like. It's like really bringing in some new things and being open and holding space for how shocked a person might be or how disrupted they might feel without continuing that self-neglect, self-sacrifice, and let them feel their feelings and deal with the grief or whatever that comes with the change or shift in those relationships.
No, I think I'm like snap, snap, snap. like no, I think that was super good. I think as you were talking, what came to mind, or I guess it's like piggybacking off of what you said. There was a show, it's a Grey's Anatomy, so not there was a show, an episode of Grey's Anatomy, and without having to go into detail about the whole episode, essentially, I think maybe so. What the example I'm about to give is not related to at all what we're talking about. I think like one of the characters was coming out, her family was finding out that she was going to be identifying as bisexual, dating a woman, etc. And her partner, because she was ready to just cut the family off, like just which again is a risk we take sometimes when we're setting boundaries. And I think we risk like losing our systems, whatever the case may be. But her partner essentially told her, like, in so many words, like, be a little gracious. Like, you're the one changing the game. Like, this is the system you grew up in. You've always been complicit in it. Like, this is how it's always been. You should anticipate that there will be pushback. Like, you're the one who's disrupting the flow. No matter how dysfunctional it is, I'm thinking family in particular. Like, no matter how dysfunctional it may be, those of us who are choosing to embark on this journey, we're disrupting this system that for everybody else, who knows if it's working or not, because they're all continuing to be complicit in it. It doesn't have anything to do with your boundary. You still set it, you still hold it. I think it's just the thing where we shouldn't expect that people will excitedly. So I guess just kind of setting that as you prepare to set boundaries, I guess piggybacking off what you both have said, you should anticipate some pushback. And kind of like we said in the accountability episode, that's people and their emotions, and that's not your job to manage. But part of the boundaries you have to work past that being contingent on, like, it only went well if the person was like, I hear you, great. In an ideal world, that would be the case. But I think those of us setting boundaries in our family is probably because there ain't a whole bunch of people who've done the work to be able, like, usually to respect the boundary, you have to also believe in boundaries, also honor boundaries. And if you haven't did that work, you like, what the fuck is you and your boundary shit? And I hear people say it like, I'm tired of this boundary shit. And it's usually people who ain't used to boundaries. So my long-winded way of saying, you should expect folks to feel away. It's not your job to manage that. But I'd say also don't necessarily, I try not to expect that people will be super excited about it. Like, I'm trying to share that being a part of my process, because that just goes back to me avoiding shit, me avoiding the discomfort. It's okay if this gets uncomfortable. I tell my clients, as long as when you walk away, your boundary is set and you're honoring it, that's all that matters. People can be mad, they could cry, that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's a good opportunity after you start setting boundaries, and in general, when you feel discomfort or like maybe you did something wrong or will be perceived as bad, that you step in and offer yourself the support that you would like to receive from the external world. So whatever it is you would have wanted that person who you set the boundary with to say to you, you have to provide to yourself. And if you have a hard time doing that, this is where inner child work is really helpful, where you get to hold and carry yourself through the pain of it. So after you set a boundary, sometimes you are just very in your head, worrying, making up stories about what you think they might be saying. You may be right, you may be wrong, but we don't know. So we try not to stick to anything that isn't factual. But what you do know is that you're working on a relationship with yourself. You're learning how to love yourself. There's a prayer that I offer to my clients and I offer to myself often called the Ho'oponopono prayer. Said in multiple orders. The order I learned it is, I love you, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you. And you can tailor each stance or each line to mean something in particular to whatever it is you're experiencing. For boundary setting, I would say it's probably important to get in front of a mirror when you're feeling that nervousness in your body and telling yourself, I love you. I'm here for you. I got you. I'm sorry this feels so hard. I promise you it will become easier because I'm here, never leaving you, always by your side. Something to remind yourself, like, I'm not alone in this. I'm still worthy of love, and I'm still receiving the love that I need. Can carry us through those hard times. And the more you practice that prayer and the more you mean and embody it when you say it, the more real it becomes. And it can really shift the way that your internal process works and is organized. Do you all have any tips for what to do when people are feeling like dysregulated after boundary setting?
I think off the top of my head, which is like some of the like go-tos, like I tell people like whatever helpful grounding techniques are helpful for them, depending on like the level. Like I always tell folks, even like if we're logging off the session just talking about boundaries, I'm like, when you get off, just take a few breaths. Like trying to like resettle in your body is like typically where I'll start. Like where are you feeling it? Sit with that for a minute and then like try to work past it. But I think it's essentially like hold space for whatever your response is. If you're feeling alone, if you like, I just try to encourage people not to jump to fixing. And I say like that tough part that you're sitting with is also a part of the process. And that's telling you something. That's good information you're getting. Like, what is it that I'm feeling dysregulated about? Like what's underneath it? Because people usually can describe really well. And I don't know if it's the feeling. When I say feeling, I'm not talking about emotion. Like maybe they'll say like I just didn't feel good, or it just felt weird, or I felt off. And I'm like, well, that's all great. Like let's give some language to this offness and this I didn't feel good, and sit with what were you embarrassed? Are you worried? Are you nervous? Are you humiliated? Like what are you feeling? So
Yeah.
I think for me, mine is more so just spend a few minutes grounding yourself, returning to your body, but first sitting with whatever's happening and trying to figure out what is my body telling me, or what's coming, what stories am I telling myself, all of those different things.
Yep. I think it's so important, Soko, for affirming yourself the way you said with that prayer. I think that's beautiful, and grounding, definitely. Things that I've told my clients, and also just reminders of like, what is the purpose of all of this, right? How is this going to benefit everybody, right? This is, even though it's uncomfortable for me and for that person who now has to think differently about our relationship or move differently, or how I have to move differently, is that what's the bigger goal here? Like, how is this actually not just helpful for me, but it is helpful for that person, because you're going to be the one of the first people to teach them how to be in a healthy relationship. You know what I mean? And there's a greater goal in here, like, and so that you're uncomfortable already. That's why we're even in this position, right? We are doing this because we're experiencing extreme discomfort that is so familiar that we're choosing it because we know how to navigate it, but we don't feel good in it. And so, like, hey, pick your poison at this point, right? You want to be uncomfortable and stay here, or do you want to be uncomfortable and know that potentially there's an outcome where you can feel more free, whether it's free of the relationship or free to be you and express yourself and have that person respond in a healthy way so that you can move forward in the relationship. So I think those, for me, it's more like a coping kind of response to it, while also like recognizing the temporariness of all of this, that like it will eventually go away, that you get to choose the discomfort that's going to lead to something that, beyond this uncomfortable feeling, you will feel better for yourself and in that relationship or without that relationship, that you're going to be okay no matter what happens. And so I think like the combination of what you all said plus that has been really helpful with my clients to be able to kind of like take a step back, be okay with themselves, ground in the present moment of what's happening, and then kind of looking at what is the bigger picture and how can that help me to continue in setting these boundaries in this process.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing, Rob, is it's like trusting the process.
Yeah.
Trusting the process and trusting that when you opt into choosing your well-being to make sure your container is filled first, then things align. That's a principle that I just like adopt. And so far so good, right? It's hard as balls, but as as you go through it, you're like, this shit actually really does line up. When I make sure I'm good, everything else is better. I'm better for everyone else. Things come to me, things flow to me. Yeah. And I'm thinking too, like, for those of us who are more experienced in our boundary setting, aka the three of us on this show, you're gonna set we know this. We cannot control outcomes. All things do not end well, all things do not end poorly. Things end how they're supposed to end. And so what you'll find in your boundary setting is that, like Rob said, people will learn about how to set their own. Initially, they'll become uncomfortable. Some may, disappear. Those who work through it with you, they find like, oh shit, I didn't like when Rob set that boundary. What I'm finding is because she's setting that boundary, I feel a little more free in this relationship too. We've shifted into a better dynamic. And then once you're like, in a long-term relationship, I feel like it's continually setting boundaries because you're changing and you're needing new things. And then it's like super fucking safe because you're like, I already set 5 boundaries with this person. They know it's all love. They know that I'm just expressing what I need, and vice versa. Then it becomes like this really beautiful place, I think, to like play and grow with someone else. So it really does end up serving us, but you got to go through a little bit of mud sometimes.
And I love what you said about all things don't end well, but all things don't end poorly either. And I think ultimately it's like, so kind of like taking steps, because now I'm just thinking barriers, like what are the barriers in this? And I'm like, I think sometimes, and I'm speaking from my own personal experience, like again, we start to tell ourselves these narratives. We start to have ideas of like worst case, and like most people, worst case takes the charge if you aren't present and able to pull yourself back. So if you decide that this is going to be the end, or this might mean losing access, or whatever that may be, you're like that all comes up for you. And shit, started losing my train of thought as I was going. But I think essentially where I was going with that was to say, barriers to setting boundaries is I think that sometimes we can get caught up in worst case, best case. And I tell people, you're just figuring out what you need for now. Like in that spiral, you all off into what does this look like down the years, and what happens if we aren't speaking when I'm married, or when I have kids, or when I have this and this. And it's like, ain't none of that stuff happening right now. And like, yes, it's all normal, so I'm not going to say you shouldn't, but it's working through that to remind yourself, I'm figuring this out for now. This boundary I'm setting is something that's needed now. Who's to say? Maybe the person's going to honor it and our relationship grows and develops, and all of these what ifs are irrelevant because we're in a better place. Or maybe we aren't in a better place. I guess what I'm saying is, I think it's really important to meet yourself in the here and now. Get clear on what's not serving you, because if you're setting a boundary, something in this dynamic is not serving you. So getting clear on what about this is not serving me, what's harming me, what's just making me feel uncomfortable. Because I think the other piece is, and maybe this is still harming away, for folks who are like, maybe it's a friend group, right? And you just always leave feeling drained. Like no one, like you're not the target of anything. Like and that's where I see people challenging too. Like, well, ain't nobody really doing nothing. Like I just ain't fit. If you feel exhausted, if this dynamic isn't serving you and it's taken from you, that's also a reason to set a boundary. Like it doesn't have to be that somebody is stealing from you or not being honest or manipulative. Those are I think the easy places. But sometimes it could just be, this used to be real cool and I really used to enjoy this and I don't. That's reason enough for you to sit with self. And that reminder that and Rob sent me a video on IG recently that perfectly summed it up, like the difference between boundaries and rules. Boundaries are something you set for yourself. I'm not going to allow an if crossed XYZ, versus I think we often get caught up in rules. Like I set a boundary for so and so, they know not to do XY. We can't control other people. Like you can't tell your dad not to call you. You can tell him, if he has your number, he can still try to call. So the point isn't to be like, this is what you can't. I'm not in a space where I'm going to accept any calls from you. And I'm not. I can't control whether you call or not. I can't control those. So I guess I'm just saying, reminding yourself, you always have the power, because this is something you're doing for yourself. You don't need if I needed to set a boundary with Soko and Rob, I don't need them to agree with me. I don't need them to also feel like this boundary is important and they see where I'm coming from. This is something I'm doing for me. I'm just telling you, if XYZ behave, if this line is crossed, then who knows what? Well, we can talk about what the consequence is, but yeah.
Listen, as a therapist and processing people's stuff all day, every day, my friends will tell you like they don't talk to me as much as they used to before I became a therapist because my capacity is different now for like certain things, and it has nothing to do with what they have to say to me. It has nothing to do with like I'm here for it. Like, what's going on, girl? Let me, if I can offer some insight or feedback, I love to because I love my friends and I care about them. But I also had to recognize that like if I'm finding myself wandering off from like not present because I'm overloaded, that like, you know what I'm saying, that I have to like set that boundary for myself that like I literally cannot show up right now because I've just heard about 6 other people who got this and that going on. So like my friends know that like if they don't hear from me, that it's not that for me it's my boundary of like holding space for quiet silence, my own stuff that I need to like detach from, work through and stuff like that. And so like for sure, like if I recognize that I'm feeling exhausted by a conversation from a friend, and it doesn't have anything to do with them doing anything to me, but in our normal relationship, this is how we've existed. And now that I don't have the capacity, because I'm also kind of doing this with a lot of other people that I have to have some level of emotional care for so that I could be a good therapist, I have to also like I have to express that in my relationships outside of work because of the type of work that I do. But going back to what you were saying about barriers, this is kind of like a question, I guess, is like we're talking about relationships in general, right? Family relationships, I mean, all of us can relate, as our roles in these relationships kind of dictate like what we can do and what we can't do. If it's a parent child relationship or a sibling relationship, like I know in Black families it's like family over everything, or like but it's your mama though, but it's your daddy though, like, and all these things that are very dismissive of like violations to our well-being by these relationships. But also there's romantic relationships, there's work relationships, and like what does it look like to set boundaries in all these different type of relationships where we have to be mindful of our livelihood, where we're looking to move forward and like start our own family, and like I don't know if any whatever what types of things have come up for you and your clients like in those particular relationships. I know a lot come up for work related relationships and like romantic relationships, even with dating. Like where do I start from? Do I put it all out on the table and say this is what I want, this is what I need? Is there a lead in? Is there like, because people are afraid to like scare people off, to lose people, and like, or do we just teach getting rid of that fear and just saying what's up and letting the chips fall where they may, or is there some sort of balance?
I like my approach with my clients who I know are brave enough is I just really encourage them to just get out there and fucking try it first. And, I'm telling this to clients who know how to ground, who are not going to harm themselves, who have support systems. Try it. Try it so that you know what happens. And then the next time we meet, I want to process that emotion. I want to process how you process that emotion, what you're doing with it now, where it's sitting. I preach like I encourage people to take leaps, because that's when quantum leaping, that's when you grow, you cellularly change. Mm-hmm. And so most of my clients are already geared up to know that their evolution requires big leaps. And this is one of them. So I guess what it is, Rob, I'm getting under it, is like I teach my clients how to become comfortable with discomfort and how to establish new relationship with discomfort. Discomfort does not mean you're doing something wrong. Discomfort and pain, when intentional, means, or when you're going through it intentionally, means growth, means you come out on the other side a bit freer. So I think that perspective is helpful in the boundary setting process.
Yeah. And no, absolutely. And like you said, when you said like being comfortable and the uncomfortable, I think I talk to my clients a lot about emotions existing along a spectrum, and I might have even said that on another episode. And I like will remind them, you, but also this person. Part of the human experience is you live along the whole spectrum. Like we like to live in the feel goods, but that's not realistic. Like I say this over and over, good's only good because bad exists. If sadness wasn't an emotion, then joy probably wouldn't be as much as what it was because it would just be the baseline. You wouldn't really be as familiar. So all of them exist for a reason. And I always tell people, okay, you set this boundary and your partner's upset or they're sad or they're tearful or they're crying. They're having a human experience and they deserve to have a human experience. And it's not your job to save them from that human experience. And I
Yeah.
try to say it that way so people can, and to me, because people can struggle. They're like, so I should just leave them like that. I should just leave them crying. I'm not saying I'm not being supportive. And there's a difference between supporting people and then trying to fix or correct whatever response they're having. And this could all be you should. Like, I'm not even saying they're like, hey, you made me cry, fix it. Sometimes, in either case, it ain't your job to fix. If I'm an empathetic person, I can support you kind of in this moment. But again, it's not my job. So I just kind of tell people to remind themselves that it's a spectrum because like you said, a lot of the barrier is people are like, what does that look like, especially in romantic relationships? That's what I hear a lot of. Oh, well, we'll be into it and we going, well, you into it with yourself right now. Like you're not getting along with yourself because you're allowing this thing. So
Mm-hmm.
fear of getting into it, what's the worst that happens if a little conflict arises, if a little challenge spots, as long as you're so similarly to self, I'm like, you just have to do it. You have to anticipate, again, like I said earlier, you have to anticipate that this person may have a response that is uncomfortable because it just is. Like, this may not be smooth and easy, but you have to, and I think I remind people too, again, going back to like this boundary is for now. I think sometimes folks feel like they're setting a boundary again for the rest of your life. Like if I'm like, hey, I need to take a step back from you, then I never get to re-engage. We should always be, I think that's just part of human growth. Of course, there are those people, places, things, because boundaries ain't just with people. Like it's boundaries we'll have that just need to stay in place forever. But I think it's a process of checking in with yourself over time. How am I feeling about this? Where am I with this issue? Maybe I've done some work in what once was a boundary that's no longer important to me because it's no longer harmful. Or maybe I decide I'm strengthening. Like you have choices. I think I have to remind people like you have choices in this family relationship. Just because it's mama, to your point, Rob, just because you have choices. Just because it's your BFF since second grade, you have just because it's the job you have choices, and those choices also include revisiting the boundaries, modifying the boundaries, checking in and reminding yourself, why did I even set the boundary? If the reason's still valid, keep rolling with it. If you're like, that's no longer important. So I think it's a number of things. Reminding, just do it. It's a spectrum of emotions and helping them to see their partner is having a human experience so it could help mitigate any guilt that you feel like you need to fix. You're human. Humans are allowed to be sad and allowed to cry and all those things. And it's not written in stone. If you decide I'm in a space where I think I trust that we might be able to navigate this differently. Let's re-engage and try it out.
Yeah, what I mean.
And then you have a new process. You got to sit with the nervousness and
Mm-hmm.
do the ego work to be able to re-enter newly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing you say, Tris, which I don't know if this is kind of like a bullet point of like what I'm hearing you say is that number one, you always have to be assessing your needs and reassessing your needs as time
Yep.
goes on and things change. You also have to kind of look at the people that you are in relationship with and kind of like, accept who they are and where they are at so that you can have realistic expectations about what can happen in these relationships so you know what the boundaries look like, if you can stay in relationship or can you shift the relationship, um and then like yeah, this the constant reassessment of our needs, the constant acceptance of like who people are, or maybe identifying like what's triggering right now or what's triggering in these situations. What are the things that send me into the place where I feel like I need to retreat from this situation? Are they avoidable? Not in a way that makes me like overextend myself or contort myself in some way that's not okay. But like, yeah, I'm not going to talk to this person about religion or politics because then they start to like, overstep in certain ways that don't make me feel comfortable and the relationship, gets disrupted in some way. Is that something that I could say, hey, that's just not something I'm going to engage with this person because I do value them in so many other ways? Or is the trigger so big that it's like, yeah, no, this is just not at the point I'm at in my life right now. This person is very disruptive to my nervous system, my emotional state, and all those type of things. But yeah, there's always choices. We always get to change our boundaries, and like having boundaries allows us to see who actually is out here having boundaries we didn't even know was having boundaries with us. Like if we feel some kind of way about like how they're showing up for us, and it's like, well, shoot, they actually have had really good boundaries and they're saying no to things. And I'm like, well, why would you say no to me when I show up and do da 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 for you? Right. And it's like, well, no, that's okay for them to say no to us. And it's okay for us to say no and not go the extra mile out of like sustaining a relationship in a way that didn't actually feel good to us. Like I'm doing all these extras to keep this hanging on to this relationship for my own reassurance and validation that it's going to be there. And this person is like, yeah, when I can't do it, I say no. And now that I have a boundary, I'm like, oh, I can see, I could see why they're very firm in like not overstepping. Like I can't see people on Saturdays because I work 6 days a week, or I can't, show up for you in this way because I'm tired, and it's okay. That's okay. Just because you decided in your fatigue to come out and do all the things I asked, I asked of you. So that's a little bit, yeah.
Rob, the end of what you said, I'm like, oh, we could really go 5 more episodes, because what it sounds like is, let's say that is someone's circumstance. They have to set a boundary because they're tired. So it's like, okay, job well done on step 1. Step 2 is, why your ass tired?
No.
Sounds like you need another boundary, So it can kind of keep going. Okay, so real quick, y'all, I concocted the levels of boundary setting. And this is this is no rule, okay? Just like a structure. Level 1, I want to be liked, therefore I have no boundaries. Level 2, growing in resentment, noticing passive-aggressive behavior, aka throwing attitude. Level 3, getting in tune with your emotions and being like, oh, now I understand why this bothers me. Level 4, putting up distance between others so that you can kind of dissect and analyze the dynamics. Understand the why. What am I doing to allow this to take place, and what is this other party doing? Level 5, choosing who is actually worth discussing boundaries with. I think sometimes you just set it, and then sometimes you can actually dialogue about it, and sometimes you just let the relationship go. Next would be setting the boundary and caring and worrying about what people think of you. Then setting the boundary, so the next level, setting the boundary and not giving a fuck. And then I was speaking with someone last night. He's doing a lot of breath work right now. And he was saying he's now at the point where he doesn't have to consciously set boundaries or deal with the aftermath of pain. It's just naturally the way he's navigating is just with the boundary instilled. So I'm like, oh,
that's top notch. Yes.
top tier boundaries right there. Just unconscious out here.
The top flight boundary setter. I'll work on getting this on a visual, and Rob's genius can hopefully get this onto the visual of this podcast, so you guys can maybe see a little outline of boundary setting. But y'all have anything to add to that, to the levels?
Go ahead, Rob.
I was going to say that final level, the boss, the King Koopa of boundaries, or anybody's in Nintendo. But anyways, the boundary, that top tier boundary, that unconscious, like you've done all the steps of being intentional to where it's like just natural, like a reflex. Oh, that's such a beautiful place to be in. And you may not be in that in every single like aspect of your life and boundary setting, but you will know how that feels, and that feeling, hold on to it, because you're going to want to pull that into so many other areas of your life. But I think that's a great list that you came up with, Soko, in the like kind of like the process the level
Yeah.
process, leveling up, and it's probably going to be very rough, not neat. Like it's not going to just be on the trajectory for everything. It's going to be much like grief. It's probably going to be a back and forth, and other things are going to come in to challenge those different levels. But like when you do experience that level of acceptance and like connection with yourself, and you feel the goodness what comes from that, hold on to it and remember it every time you feel like you're questioning, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I was just gonna add, I love the whole flow and structure. I just want people, as we're looking at it, to remind yourself when we're talking about the others, you can be the other, right? Like sometimes the boundary setting needs to happen with us, like with ourselves. We be needing boundaries like with self too. So I think I love it. And like I think I'm just reminding people it applies to you and you. Like it's not just about external other people. Like there are lots of folks who I see who their biggest struggles are not even other people. I'm like, you're your own boundary crosser. So I love that. And I love the idea of people also allowing themselves to be the other person they're addressing in this process. So I think it's a dope framework for external relationships, but also our internal relationship we have with ourselves.
For sure.
But yeah, like you said, so it feels like we could talk about this forever. Like I'm thinking like people in relationships, that's its own beast, like in romantic one, like all of these things, but boundaries you can go on and on for days and days. But I think the biggest takeaways is y'all know if you need the boundaries, set them. You'll be cool. You'll figure the shit out. Of course, we're making it sound way easier. It's way easier said than done. But if it's hard, it should be hard. You're doing something new. You're doing a new thing.
Yeah.
Like it's gonna be tough. And like Sok said in the beginning, I think in addition to the big kahuna in the beginning, you may feel like you become super rigid. Like once you set one, then they're just everywhere. And I think normally people really lean in. And then once they find their rhythm and flow, kind of like your client, it starts to be, I'm not having all these conversations, or it feels more smooth and stuff. So just ride the wave, trust the process. And I think as long as it's a step towards you feeling better, it's worth you leaning in. I mean, what's the worst that happens? You are uncomfortable. Like Rob said, you're already uncomfortable. So you can be it alone, or you can have somebody sharing this burden with you. So thanks for riding this good ride with us. I think Sok was the resource this week. Them steps I think is great.
We're gonna hit you.
How do we know the steps? Because we fucking live this shit, right?
Very much so living it. Still on many different levels that you outlined in different situations and relationships.
We are therapists, but we are out here doing the same work y'all doing.
That's what makes a good therapist, is someone actually living and experiencing life and having those, difficulties and overcoming them, being able to share that. Number one, we feel it, and also we have experienced what it feels like on the other side of some of this. So, it's possible.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
that's right.
Appreciate y'all riding the ride. We'll catch y'all next time.
Chill and chill as fuck podcast.
We in here, baby.
Let's get it.